Next for today's program, I'd like to have Dr. Bob Murphy come on up and introduce today's speaker.
It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Greg Young. He's going to talk about 9/11, this year's Generations Pearl Harbor. Greg is a friend of mine, and he has an interesting history. He has a BS of political science from Oregon State University. He did ROTC there. And then he also has a master's from National Security Affairs and National Security Affairs from the Naval Postgraduate Program School, and a PhD in International Relations from the University of Colorado in Boulder. He currently is a professor of political science and international relations at the University of Colorado, where he's been since 2007 to the present. You want a fun time sometime, go, I went to a couple of his classes a couple of weeks ago on world, War and Peace, and also the Arab Spring. It was very interesting. He engages incredibly well with the students. Gregory was a commander in the U.S. Navy from 1975 to 1998. He flew P-3s. And interesting, he is an author of a book called The Last Century, which was the book which Tom Clancy based off the Hunt for Red October. So he's got a very interesting background, and very pleased to welcome Dr. Greg.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. I want to thank you all, thank the Rotary for inviting me again. It's one thing to be invited, but this is my fifth trip here. So if you've been around the Rotary about 18 years, I think I did Veterans Day like 3 years ago, and I did Pearl Harbor Day like 3 years before that. And I can't remember the one I did before that. I'm getting too old to remember which one but it's nice now that I'm kind of sandwiched in between Pearl Harbor Day and Veterans Day, so I'm kind of trying to tie them a little bit more together today. I'm sorry, Gary, I wanted to thank Gary for inviting me also, and he can't be here today. He's doing a very Rotarian thing and helping out a friend today. So this topic, I was a little worried before I chose it that it might be perceived as controversial or political. When you start talking about recent topics of war and peace, it's much easier to talk about World War II. You know, or even Vietnam, you get a lot more agreement, but that can, create a fight in a room as well. But I will tell you that my students, if I have a bias, and I do, it's that I am a raging centrist. Now, my wife thinks I'm a fence sitter, and I assure her that raging centrism is an ideology unto itself. And if my students can figure out my bias, more power to them. But it's we're perceived to be erroneously, I believe, a very liberal, the entire faculty, of course, are raging liberals and are pushing liberal agendas. And I can tell you within the political science department and the international affairs department at CU, that is not the case. It is really not the case. And I invite you to go to see any class, but you're always welcome in mine as well. But to talk about the exit from Afghanistan right now, which I'm going to do a little bit, that is controversial. And there's a perception that those that are condemning the withdrawal tend to be on one side of the spectrum, and those who say it's the right thing to do tend to be on the other. But it's important to remember a couple of things. My students, I remind them, the war in Iraq, for example, you can get Republicans and Democrats to agree about that. Those who tend to lean in the Democratic direction tend to think going into Iraq was a mistake. Those who, on the other end toward the Republican spectrum, believe getting out of Iraq was a mistake. But the good news is, how nonpartisan is that? We all agree it was a mistake. So we keep that in mind if you believe I'm going a little bit too far. I didn't get my... So just a quick review. You all know World War II, and we're approaching Pearl Harbor Day in just 2 days, but Admiral Yamamoto, who led the raid on Pearl Harbor, was quoted as saying, "I fear that all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with terrible resolve." But in fact, we know that despite the cost of Pearl Harbor, if there was something good out of that, it was that idea that it really galvanized US public opinion, which had been divided over trying to remain isolationist as what is the American cultural tradition, stay out of this European war, but galvanized US public opinion to defeat fascism around the world. And in fact, America defeated fascism in 4.5 years. And relatively unscathed. Now, it's very difficult to think that 254,000 casualties or deaths is unscathed, but relatively compared to the 23 million Soviets that died, the 11 million Japanese that died, the 9.5 million Germans that died, the 2 million French that died, 254,000 is relatively unscathed. But we became the hegemon of the world, truly. I mean, the Soviet Union was absolutely devastated. We owned 56% of the world's economy. The world's GDP was in American hands. The greatest generation, they were called. They came home. They proceeded to create the American dream. It's Ozzie and Harriet. It's Father Knows Best. And the United States was admired around the world for our ideals and for what we did in World War II. And you could obviously say that it was a lot of Pearl Harbor that committed the United States to what Studs Terkel called in his book, but of course in quotations, the good war. Now, I'm of the opinion, despite my own 24 years in the military and my father's 32 years in the military, that there is no good war. If you have to get as close to that as you can, it's probably World War II. But there is no good war. There's no good civil war. There's no good interstate war. They're all bad. And it's very easy to find controversy over the participation and the withdrawal in those. But again, keep that in perspective. But after 9/11, there was a similar effect on the American people. Within a month, the 101st Airborne, I think it was the 101st, could have been the 82nd, parachuted into Kandahar, into Osama bin Laden's former base, and which began the global war on terror, as it's called, the GWAT. And very quickly, US Special Forces, in combination with air assets, combined with what was called the Northern Alliance, toppled the Taliban regime, which had ruled Afghanistan brutally for 5 years prior to that time. But in doing so, after 9/11, largely that effort to invade Afghanistan, topple that regime, was supported by the American people. It was sanctioned by the UN, and it was a NATO force. And again, the United States was largely looked upon as what we were doing was accepted by those citizens around the world. But in March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. And equally quickly as the toppling of the Taliban regime, the regime of that thug Saddam Hussein was brought down in actually a week shorter than Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of Defense, predicted. But if you're looking for successes in the Iraq War, it's difficult to find many after that. That goodwill, if you could talk about the unfortunate tragedy of 9/11, did create goodwill for the United States in our effort to defend ourselves in the wake of 9/11. But that goodwill largely disappeared as a result of what they believed is an unnecessary invasion based on false pretenses of Saddam Hussein reconstituting his WMD programs, chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs that had been eliminated after Gulf War I, but no evidence was found that that reconstitution existed. But more important than that, absolutely more important was the failure to understand what it would take to occupy Iraq. And our attempts now not to just topple the regime. Now, Saddam Hussein was a thug. He killed 5,000 of his own people, particularly Kurdish people, with poison gas in Halabja during the Iran-Iraq War. He invaded neighboring Kuwait. He invaded neighboring Iran. But if that is the justification for U.S. invasion, we should have invaded Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe killed more people than Saddam Hussein. We should have invaded Cambodia. Pol Pot killed way higher percentage of his people but we didn't. We chose the idea at this unipolar moment of the United States to invade Iraq. Yes, we got rid of a brutal dictator. There's no question. But unfortunately, there was no planning to do, if the idea Donald Rumsfeld believed we would topple Saddam and we would be home in 6 months, we'd have elections, we would be welcomed as liberators. As you know, Iraq is a mix of Sunni Arabs, Shia Arabs, and Sunni Kurds. Of those three groups, we were welcomed only by the Kurds, who we had helped in Gulf War I. But basically, the Sunni and Shia, the Sunni did not want us there. The Shia were happy to get rid of Saddam, but didn't want us there either. And it only took, within 3 months, the first attack on the UN mission in Iran, evidence that the start of a real insurgency. And by 2006, we lost less than 200 people. 200 young men and women died in the invasion, less than. But we had lost 5,000 by 2006 in the insurgency. And the failed strategy of things like Abu Ghraib and whack-a-mole tactics of pulling insurgents out of their homes in the middle of the night. And if we didn't find the guy we were looking for, we'd lock him up in Abu Ghraib. And let me remind you here, maybe for my parents' generation, it was Pearl Harbor that influenced the way they thought about war. For maybe the younger generation, of which there aren't that many here, but our generation, you guys and me and the baby boomers, it was Vietnam. And my father, who was 32 years in the military, used to tell me that, Vietnam was a political failure, not a military failure. I'm very proud of my 24 years of service and my father's 32 years of service. Vietnam was both a political and a military failure. And so I have some credibility. I get to teach the fun courses like Bob mentioned, Revolution, War and Peace, But I've been teaching a course on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan now for the last 6 years. And I can tell you the biggest failure was the strategy in Iraq, what we call direct counterinsurgency. David Petraeus talked about something called indirect coin and persuaded George W. Bush to do something despite the fact that the Iraq war had dropped to absolute depths of approval from the American people. Chose to not only increase the number of troops in Iraq, but he chose also to change the strategy. But I think American people overlooked the fact that part of it was persuading a lot of the Sunni sheiks in Iraq to change sides, changing the U.S. strategy from search and destroy or whack-a-mole to something called indirect coin. That is winning hearts and minds, not pulling out of the green zone in up-armored Humvees and patrolling with body armor, instead living in the towns you're supposed to protect, patrolling on foot in combination with Sunni militias or with the Iraqi army. And that was a success. It created a security space in Iraq by 2006. U.S. casualties plummeted from almost 2,000 in 2006 to less than 30 in 2008. That created a security space that unfortunately the Iraqi government did not fill. And what happens, what grows in spaces, empty spaces, weeds grow. What grew in the political and security vacuum when President Obama withdrew troops in Iraq? What grew? ISIS. So the invasion of Iraq certainly destroyed Iraqi stability, got rid of a dictator. The surge created a security space, but unfortunately we didn't stay long enough to capitalize on that security space. So ISIS grew out of that. But we came home from Iraq. Unfortunately, we had to go back because of ISIS in a smaller presence. But let's talk about what I'm really here in the short period of time I have left to ask you a few questions about Afghanistan. Known as the graveyard of empires. You know, the British tried and left. They did come back and stay for 50 years, but the Russians and then the Soviets also tried to influence Afghanistan. They did not change the culture. The United States, unfortunately, armed the Mujahideen against the Soviets. The same people we fought against in Afghanistan, who trained them and armed them? The United States did, okay? Why did we go in? I already mentioned, we went in because the Afghan government of Mullah Omar provided sanctuary to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden for him to plan and execute the planes operation that became 9/11. But you could make the case after Osama bin Laden was kicked out and then later killed, that was no longer the mission. So the idea then was, well, this new Afghan government, we're going to provide security. We're going to provide security for their elections. We're going to allow them to implement some kind of, I think the really belief was we would be allowed to create some sort of Jeffersonian democracy in Afghanistan. Well, guess what? In 20 years, I think, did some good things in some of the population centers, but 20 years of American and NATO involvement, we did not change the culture of Afghanistan one iota. And by the time we left, the Afghan government was only controlling less than half of their country. The Taliban had already, largely at first, because of we forgot about Afghanistan, we went into Iraq. President Obama came into office with the idea we're gonna leave Afghanistan. Democrat. President Trump came into office that we're gonna leave Afghanistan. Republican. President Biden came into office with the idea we're gonna leave Afghanistan. A Democrat. If we were still there and in the next election we get a Republican, I would bet that president would say, it's time to leave Afghanistan. Obama, there's in a new book out by Peril and a couple of others, Obama wanted to leave, but he was warned of what would happen in Afghanistan if the United States left. And because of the success of the surge in Iraq, he was persuaded by General David Petraeus and General McChrystal they wanted 160,000 more troops in Afghanistan, essentially putting a platoon on every street corner in a country of 29 million people, much larger than Iraq, to create that same kind of security space. But if you're going to do that kind of thing, that indirect coin, can you go there for a year and leave? Can you go there for 2 years and leave? The British stayed in Malaya for 26 years to end an insurgency there. So I'm not even sure 26 years would have done it, but regardless, this is not cheap to do. General McChrystal and General Petraeus, unfortunately, President Obama chose to do, I think, the worst. The debate was either come home from Afghanistan or increase the troops in Afghanistan. What do you think in that very American way that President Obama did? The middle, right? The compromise. When in fact, sometimes, despite that's a very American thing to do, the compromise is the worst possible choice. Those that believed that the Taliban posed no international threat, we were never going to change that culture, it was time to come home. And those that believed we could win hearts and minds and finish this battle of creating a Jeffersonian democracy among the Pashtun people. You know, in Afghanistan, there are some 22 different ethnic groups. Most people, it is the least educated and poorest country in the world. They speak 14 different languages. Most of the people have never been more than 50 miles from their own home. Winning hearts and minds there is very difficult. But General McChrystal ultimately got fired because he said bad things about Obama in Rolling Stone magazine. But the effort to carry out was created. It did create a minor security space that allowed the Afghan government to secure a few more cities. So the military was no longer caring about the reason that they went into, but the U.S. military, this is good news and bad news. I'm going to run out of time very quickly. I'm used to talking for an hour and 15 minutes. The military, U.S. military, has got the best can-do attitude of any. You tell the U.S. military what to do, they say, give a cheery eye and carry out the plan of the day. That is the American military's, one of its best and worst qualities. Get rid of Osama bin Laden? We'll do that. Provide security? We'll do that. Build a nation state that provides women's rights and rule of law? We'll try that too. And that culture, it proved to be, to some degree, along with American strategic culture, that we have this kind of idea that we have the capacity to save the world. The American military, we spend more, than the next, used to be 10 countries, 13 countries combined. That gives us the capacity to do many good things. It also gives us the capacity for presidents to decide to use that military because he or she can. From my time in the military and my father's, I'm one of those that believe there is a place for the use of force in the world. The trouble is, the longer I teach this stuff, the bar for what is acceptable for the use of force keeps getting up there. The Obama surge was reasonably successful, but it was very short-lived. So I just want to finish with kind of these questions. Why was the U.S. there? We were there because of Al-Qaeda was there. Then we were there to provide security. By the time we left, we only had 3,500 trigger pullers. Actually, guys that shot guns. You cannot provide security or prop up a regime with 3,500 combat people. Now, I care about women's rights. I care about the fact that the Taliban regime was brutal, cuts off people's hands for thievery, like the old Ottoman Empire. It eliminated kite flying. It kept women from going to school. But you know what? They were just like that for 5 years, and we didn't invade. That didn't make us want to invade, so why is that a reason to stay there? If you want to make women's rights happen around the world, it's the U.S. Marine Corps, which has the power to deliver kinetic force on target with great accuracy. Are those the people to deliver women's rights to Afghanistan? By having election security, even when you have a U.S. Marine providing election security, that isn't necessarily what the people want to see. They may be effective at it on a short term, but they need their own local police and their own people. The Afghan National Army, I have a panel of Afghan vets in my class, told me that anybody who believed that the Afghan Army wouldn't fold in 5 minutes when the U.S. was not studying their textbooks. The Afghan Army, the Taliban Army folded when we invaded in 2001 in 5 minutes. So why wouldn't they do it again? I think the withdrawal could have been carried out better, but it was time to come home. And if you think it would have been any different if we left a year from now, or 2 years from now, or 5 years ago, so is the military the appropriate? Probably not. Ashraf Ghani, the president, left immediately. As soon as the U.S., he didn't even wait to see if the Afghan army was going to hold him. He was out of there. This is one of the most corrupt countries in the world and the poorest country in the world. Are we fighting for democracy in one of these countries? Pretty hard to believe. So what was the cost totally of the global war on terror? 8,000 killed. There's a great quote from Joe Stalin. Joe Stalin used to say the death of one person in war is a tragedy. The death of 1 million is merely a statistic. 8,000, that's 8,000 families that lost fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, children. That's awful. 22,000 more were wounded. For a war of this long, that's actually phenomenal. Our ability to triage on the battlefield has created so many more people that were wounded that would have died. But I'll tell you the statistic. Is there a pointer on here? There it is. Oops. That last one kills me. 30,000 global war on terror veterans have committed suicide since they came home. More than the combined, about the same as the combined number of killed and wounded. I feel for every one of those families who feel that the withdrawal did not pay the appropriate tribute to what their loved one, the sacrifice that they made. But Foch in World War I kept saying on the French side, attack, 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 out of tribute to those who have died before you. That's not paying tribute to those that have died before you. That's causing more people to die for something that, yes, there was good. We created some things in the cities, but if you look at Afghanistan today and the Taliban today, there are elements that are trying to be more moderate, but already out in the villages, there are hands being cut off, there are women's being denied the right to go to school, and that's terrible. But that's a job for the UN, that is a job for NGOs. I fully believe we should put economic pressure on the Taliban to make those issues, to try to improve those issues. But it's time to bring the young men and women home. On that upbeat note, I don't know if we have time for questions, but.
Do they want to go first? Sure.
Maybe Meryl can unmute.
Well, thanks for speaking to our club. I agree completely there's no good war, and that World War II was, despite the carpet bombing of Dresden and Tokyo, about as close as you can come to a good war. But here's my question. How is it that a representative democracy like the United States has been in one war, invasion, or military operation almost continuously for the last 120 years? How is it that is that possible?
We got another hour and a half? No. There are a couple of things. The United States strategic culture traditionally, you take the musket from over the fireplace, you form up on the village commons, you go out and defeat the evil foe quickly, you return, put the musket back up over, and then you go about your economic pursuits and innovating. But after World War II, we became the global hegemon. We began to outspend everyone else. And the United States kind of changed that notion. And it was largely, at first, it was the global communist threat that persuaded people we needed to be engaged in Europe to prevent Europe from falling into communist hands. Without going into a long story, but the US had this idea that, and it had always been around, that kind of shining city on the hill of Governor Winthrop on the decks of the Arabella before they sailed on the Mayflower of the United States, that we shall be seen as a shining light upon a hill to Christianize or democratize the world, again, has its both good and bad outcomes. That's one. Two, after 9/11, there was this perception by the Bush administration that, and some refer to the neocons as this unipolar moment, that we did not have just the opportunity to influence things around the world, but we had an obligation. Bipolarity was gone. The threat of the Soviet Union, as President Obama called the Russia, just a gas station with nuclear weapons, that was gone, and we had people like Paul Wolfowitz chanted that agenda that we should be intervening around the world to influence this opportunity to create democracy, even at the point of a gun. And like you could say, well, that never works. Well, it kind of did in Germany and Japan, but that was a different idea. I think we now know the failure of the post-Cold War world was this idea that you could intervene in Somalia, you could intervene in Bosnia, you could intervene and make a difference. And after the failures in Bosnia and Somalia, the global coalition to continue those interventions kind of faded. The United States, though, in the Bush administration said that idea that we have not just, again, the opportunity, but an obligation to do it. And that does not mean we can't make good outcomes, but what you can do, the military can create a little security space, but then it becomes the object. To do counterinsurgency, it's 90% political and 10% military. The military can create that security space, but then the political forces, global, need to come in and create governance and stability. And the military doesn't do that. But that's a long answer to your question.
Thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I think it's pretty clearly established at this point that the United States military is the best in the world at breaking things. The question is, if there are lessons to be taken from Vietnam and Afghanistan and elsewhere about our ability to actually build democratized states, it seems like we're not very good at that. And so if we don't want to just sit on the sideline, what is the lesson of history about what we can and should be doing?
Let me give you two great quotes. You probably know these. General Mattis, when he became Secretary of Defense under Donald Trump, was actually criticizing, not Trump specifically, but the new defense budget for cutting the State Department budget and increasing the Defense Department budget. He Mattis said, you know, for every dollar you cut from state, I've got to buy more bullets for defense. Andrew Basevich, one part of this counterinsurgency trust, who had a son killed in Afghanistan, basically said it has become the militarization of U.S. foreign policy is because right now we have this incredible hammer in our toolbox, and therefore every problem out there looks like a nail. We need to diminish, it doesn't mean we necessarily need to decrease the hammer. That capability is important for deterrence too, which is another issue. The idea that George Washington said, as you know, to preserve the peace you need to prepare for war. But there's also the downside of that is when the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, you are more likely to use it, particularly if it's a bigger hammer than everyone else. So my feeling is we need to add to other tools in our toolbox and explain again that to do good around the world, you may need to create a little bit of security, but then the use of the hammer then ends there. And Donald Rumsfeld was one that didn't allow the other tools to even participate in the planning for Iraq. And I think we did a little bit better with Afghanistan in the beginning, but then we stayed for 20 years. You know, the idea that it was still a military problem, a combat problem, a security problem, not in fact a political and a nation building problem that the military does not do, or doesn't do well, I guess is a better way to phrase it. Not a great answer, I know.
Yes, to get back to Pearl Harbor, it took place a year and a half before I was born, so I don't have a good memory of it. But in 1961, when I was a senior in high school, I heard General Eisenhower's famous military-industrial complex speech. He said, we didn't have a military might until after Pearl Harbor. We have one now, we need it. But the problem for the future is that the military-industrial complex is going to become too large, give too much money to congressmen who will then buy more stuff from them. My question is, did General Eisenhower get it right? Is the military-industrial complex too big?
Well, it's a very good, Americans don't like to hear this, but that's a very good Marxist argument against, you know, why we're doing what we're doing. And you aren't allowed to use the S word or the M word in America. You know, socialism and Marxism are all, but it still explains a lot. But the point here is if you try to, I'll give you another, Nancy teaches a lot more American government than me, but the idea that if you look at why congressmen vote the way they do, you know, do they vote this way because their constituents want them to vote this way? Do they vote this way because their party wants them to vote this way? Do they vote this way because that's the way they feel in their heart it's right to vote? Or do they vote because of their campaign contributors for big business, like the military-industrial complex? The trouble is, very often, the NRA gives money to congressmen who already oppose gun control. So it's very difficult to do the cause and effect. The same is true of defense. Very often you are elected in a district where there's a military base and it's strongly Republican. It's difficult to equate that campaign contribution directly to the congressman's vote. Now, if you look at, there are lots of things you can attribute. In fact, you know, military spending at the end of the Cold War finally went down quite a bit. And a number of those big military contractors were forced to combine. And so there was a period of time, there's certainly no question that the big defense contractors can have an influence. But I would tell you that I spent a lot of time interviewing people in the Bush administration, the Vulcans as they were called, about the invasion of Iraq for a paper that I wrote. And there were more ideologues in those decision makers than people who were influenced, in my opinion, by defense contractors. Does that mean they have no impact? No, they have some impact. Absolutely. But to say in a very Marxist way that the political elite are tools for the capitalist elite, which is very much the military-industrial complex, we should be wary of the military-industrial complex, absolutely. But they are also a great employer of Americans. They also sell a great deal of weapons overseas. So to your answer, yes, they have an impact, but I don't think with the global war on terror, night vision goggles and Humvees don't cost what nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers. What we're now talking about, the buildup with China, actually is more beneficial for the military-industrial complex than the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Some battles are worth fighting, however. And one of the battles is Rotary's battle against polio. We've been a leader in that battle now for a quarter of a century.
Could the Marine Corps help with that?
Well, actually, if they were willing to carry some cold chain polio vaccine into the backcountry, and Marines, as you and I know, having been naval officers, love to get muddy, so that might work. But in fact, in your honor and in gratitude for your talk to us today, we have made a donation of 100 doses of polio vaccine. And one more small step towards winning a battle worth winning.
Thank you. Now, that includes the sugar cube? Do you get a free sugar cube with those two, or is it
Well, every once in a while.
Yeah, I didn't seem to mind the polio vaccine mandate, but thank you all very much.